My name is Dr Cerhan, and I'm a professor of epidemiology at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. So the LEO study is something we call a cohort study, and that just means we enroll people and follow them over time. It's different than a clinical trial in that we don't have a specific intervention that we do. Like in a clinical trial, you might be assigned to one arm or another arm. Here, we just enroll newly diagnosed patients, and based on whatever their physician treats them with, we record that information down, and then we follow them over time. The goal is to follow them to see what the long-term outcomes are from being a lymphoma patient. So I've trained as an epidemiologist, and so I've always been interested in understanding the host and how it interacts with the tumor, this being lymphoma, and how we can put that together with genetics and understand both what causes lymphoma, so that's a lot of my research, but also once you have lymphoma, how can we optimize the best possible outcomes? And so that really got me interested in and led me to design the first LEO study, and then it grew from there. The LEO study recruits non-Hodgkin lymphoma patients of all subtypes, but we do not recruit chronic lymphocytic leukemia patients or Hodgkin lymphoma patients. Yeah, so when we enroll patients, they provide us, after giving informed consent, they provide us access to their medical records, so we abstract their treatments and clinical factors. They provide data to us, patient-reported data. This can be things like quality of life, comorbidities, and risk factors they've been exposed to. And then they provide a blood sample that we can study the plasma, serum, and DNA from. And we use all of these factors then to understand which patients tend to have better outcomes based on their treatment, based on other factors, to kind of follow them through their entire survivorship experience. So everybody's first and foremost consented onto the study. Again, as I said, we're recruiting from 8 centers. The local center holds the personal identifying information, the personal identifiers, name, address, that sort of thing. And what's shared centrally is just what we call the LEO ID, which would be meaningless to anyone unless they had the link back to the name. So we're very careful about protecting patient privacy, and all contact with the patients really goes through their center they were recruited at. The LEO study collects quality of life when a patient enrolls at their initial diagnosis, and then we get it every year thereafter for the first 3 years, and then every couple of years after that. And one of the areas we just really started investigating that data, but what we found is that a lot of the initial deficits in quality of life occur during treatment, but that the patients tend to what we would call rebound, or even go back to levels above the population norm, which I think is encouraging for patients sort of getting through that chemo treatment. We need to think about it differently for patients who have very aggressive lymphomas and are treated with very strong chemotherapy agents. But we also track people who have indolent lymphoma, even following those that are observed. And we're still learning quite a bit around the quality of life questions. Enroll patients, they report a lot of the factors that we think might increase your risk of lymphoma or impact your long-term outcome. And that's another area we've just really been starting to spend more time. One of the more recent interesting findings is looking at level of physical activity. And we showed that patients that had higher levels and that maintained higher levels over their first 3 years had a much better long-term outcome than those that had lower levels of physical activity. Now, this was an observational study. We didn't actually intervene on people, but it suggests the next step, which would be the importance of doing a physical activity intervention to improve the outcomes of lymphoma patients. And at a high level, what we found is that there are some risk factors that seem to increase the risk of all subtypes. Obesity is one that comes up pretty regularly. And on the good side, protective effect of recreational sun exposure, for example. There are other risk factors that seem to be very specific to certain subtypes. These tend to be autoimmune diseases. Smoking tends to only be associated with some subtypes. And finally, the third big area we've really contributed to is genetics. So family history is a consistent risk factor across subtypes. Our data has contributed to that. But underlying that seems to be very specific genetic inherited genetic loci. So the risk SNPs or risk loci that increase your risk for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma look different than they do for Hodgkin lymphoma than they do for follicular lymphoma. And so we're still trying to understand that, but we have made a lot of progress. Cohort is not set up like a randomized trial to answer questions of efficacy, but it can be used to help us understand treatments and how to optimize them. One example that Leo was used in was to help answer the question about does CAR T therapy improve the outcome in relapsed refractory diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. What we were able to show by pooling our data in to provide background rates is that this new therapy actually did have spectacular results and was actually used to go forward with the FDA approval for Yescarta. Recent findings that we've shown with Leo is that, which is often very of interest to patients, is there an important role for follow-up surveillance scans? And we showed both in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and now more recently in follicular lymphoma that actually if a patient gets to the 2-year point and has had no progression, relapse of their disease, that scans actually don't help identify relapses any better than symptoms, which means that it's probably of low clinical utility to continue generalized scans because they do cause anxiety to patients, they increase radiation exposure, and they add cost to the healthcare system. We've got a lot of work in understanding tumor genomics, what the tumor can tell us about both treatment response and outcome. We have a lot of studies working on understanding inherited genetics, the host genetics, and do certain genetic backgrounds set you up for a better outcome, either in general or in response to a specific therapy. And then we're also trying to bring in additional lifestyle variables like diet, physical activity, other behavioral factors, and how that impacts outcome, because we know patients are very interested in perhaps understanding what they can do to optimize their best possible outcome. We have patient advocates on our steering committee and our external advisory board. So they play a very large role in both giving us feedback on the types of questions we ask and the amount of data we collect, with an idea that, we don't want to overwhelm the patient participant in the study. Similar studies, and even using these same Leo protocol, are open all over the world. And so at your local clinic or hospital, you should ask about availability of studies that you could get involved with.